Hello, BookTube. I'm doing a book club on this channel, the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. We do a book a month, breaking it up into 4 parts and talking about it. It's been a great deal of fun. I am managing to do a book club without a Discord, which is kind of weird. It's not common, but I'm not particularly comfortable with Discord, so my inbox is wide open. You're free to Voxer me or inbox me about anything you want about the book that we're reading. Or just sound off in the comments, which have been wonderful for every Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club pick. We are right now reading our way through Antonia Fraser's biography of Marie Antoinette, but I've already announced what next month's will be. Next month, we're going to be reading The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, the third of her historical novels about Thomas Cromwell. And I wanted to make this video to allay the fears, the worries that maybe some of you have about this book for March, because it's the third book in a series. And if you haven't read Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, you might wonder, well, can I join in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club this time around? I firmly believe that you can. I want to encourage you to try if you haven't. This is a huge undertaking, but it is a fantastic novel. And I believe it's a fantastic novel on its own. Although I won't gild the lily here. You gain immeasurably by reading the first 2 books, mainly because Mantel is so aware of her own story, not just the characters, but every little turn of phrase. And there are echoes. All throughout the trilogy, there are echoes. They show up at the weirdest places sometimes, the most unexpected places, and they have real resonance. I'm not going to insist that that's all that important, because if you were a normal reader and not a critic who's trained to pick up things like that, you might not notice a lot of those echoes anyway. And this book has a huge amount of power on its own. So this is basically a situational video to help you feel your feet underneath you if you want to jump in with this book without having read the other 2 for March. We'll be reading part 1 of this book for March, roughly 220-something pages. And I wanted to give you a brief précis of what this is, so that maybe you don't feel so leery about jumping in. Not everyone is Sarah at the Bookish Knitter, who is perfectly happy to jump into a series at any point. I believe that Mantel keeps you in mind as an author, rather than just writing and then sequel. This is a big, fat historical novel told from the very close point of view of Thomas Cromwell. We know his thoughts, his dreams, his impressions of everyone around him, but we don't know those things about anyone else unless they say it to him. He is a low-born nobody. In these novels, he's a low-born nobody from Putney who breaks with his abusive father, who was a blacksmith, goes abroad as a soldier and working in an accounting house and a whole bunch of other illicit things, and then returns to England. And eventually, by the time Wolf Hall's action commences, finds himself attached and very important in the household of Cardinal Wolsey, who had been an instrumental statesman under the reign of King Henry VIII's father, King Henry VII, and who had made King Henry VIII's England into the England that it was when we see it. Had taught King Henry VIII from infancy everything that he knew about statescraft. And was a grand figure on his own, amassing to himself livings and titles and whatnot, of a long list of such things. He was a grandee of the land on his own. Some might say the very typical image of an overmighty subject. The Cromwell novels are the stories of a cascade of downfalls. And the main downfall of Wolf Hall is the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey, that is brought about by 2 factors. One is that he fails King Henry VIII. He fails to give King Henry VIII something that King Henry VIII wants. That is a very dangerous thing to do. He fails to give King Henry VIII a papally sanctioned divorce from his rightful wife and queen, Catherine of Aragon. He comes close, but he doesn't do it. The other factor involved in his downfall is the reason why Henry wants the divorce, which is a woman named Anne Boleyn, who very much wants to be Henry's bedmate, but only if Henry gives her the kingdom. She's already seen her sister be Henry's mistress and then be cast aside. She doesn't want that to happen to her. And she hates Wolsey and vows that if she can ever work him ill, she will. Those two factors work to bring Wolsey down. And that wreckage should swamp all the smaller boats. But Cromwell is a survivor. And he manages to survive that downfall. And also to recognize and hate its architects. And to vow to himself, nothing melodramatic like this ever happens in a narrative as sensitive and complex as Mantell's, but vows revenge on those people. That's Wolf Hall, which finds Cromwell rising and rising. It seems like his fortunes will end with Wolsey's, but they don't. Instead, he rises and rises. He becomes known to the king. And somehow manages to make common cause with Anne Boleyn, who has, after all, something in common with him. The Boleyns are also nobodies. They aren't quite as nobody as the Wolseys, but they're still nobodies. She wants to be first in the land. There's also a little fainting in the direction of Anne Boleyn being sympathetic to the new learning, the new religion, and Cromwell being sympathetic to it as well. Reformation zeal. That both of them were at very dicey odds and ends to express, because what Henry thought on the subject and what he was willing to do to people who disagreed with him changed from hour to hour. That is the fall in Wolf Hall, is the fall of Wolsey. And when you get to the second book, Bring Up the Bodies, the fall is Anne Boleyn's herself, because she also fails to give Henry something that he wants. Wolsey rashly promised Henry that he could make things right with Rome in terms of divorce and remarriage. Wolsey was guilty of a lot. He was guilty of a lot that was charged against his name, but in that case, the guilt was only his, because there was no way that he could predict that. The only way that he could possibly have guaranteed beyond a shadow of a doubt what the see in Rome would do in terms of Henry VIII's divorce would be if he himself had been made pope. And even then, he would have been more vulnerable, not less, to the international pressures that Catherine of Aragon's own kinspeople could have brought to bear on him. Anne likewise made a promise that she could not possibly have known she could keep. She promised Henry a viable male heir. She promised him a son. And unless you're a member of the Bene Gesserit, you can't make that promise with 100% certainty. She was just sure. It was bravado. She told Henry what he wanted to hear, and it didn't work. So Bring Up the Bodies is the story of her fall, of her downfall. And we know how that ends. We know the ending of that story. And that brings us to the actions of the Mirror and the Light. Literally, it brings us to the opening scene, the first moment of this book. Is a head flying off a young woman's shoulders and a wash of red, a wash of blood. And this story is also the story of a downfall. It starts in 1536 and it ends in 1540. The story is told from the very close narrative viewpoint of Thomas Cromwell, and it ends in 1540 because Thomas Cromwell ends in 1540. And when the reader knows that, if you look up Thomas Cromwell, you will learn that he eventually fell. The one downfall that he is always cynically half commenting on, but cannot ever actually believe is going to happen, is his own. We know that in 1540 he will be led out of the tower and beheaded. The narrative has to go to there. That always presents people with a problem when you give a narrative a close narrative focus like this with someone who's going to die. Well, how are you supposed to get them there? Elizabeth George, for instance, does that with her novel about Mary, Queen of Scots, bringing her right to the scaffold and then a minute or two beyond. You always have to face that kind of a problem, but it's a long way off in this book. The important thing about this book, if you want to join us for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club in March for The Mirror and the Light, is, first of all, you've got a little bit of reading in front of you, but it's March of the Mammoths. So you were already psychologically prepared for a large amount of reading. The amount of reading that we'll be doing for the first weekend is 200 and something pages. We'll be reading the part of the book called Part 1. All of it. Uh, if you're thinking about it, I want to allay your fears that you can't get it, that you won't understand it if you haven't read the first two books. You can. You can definitely join us. This is the story of a man who has risen from nothing to become exactly what Cardinal Wolsey was. Cromwell is not a cardinal, but he is vicegerent under Henry for all matters religious all over England. He is the highest authority you can go beyond the king in matters clerical. He's also keeper of the Privy Seal. He is also the peak of the civic ladder as well. He is exactly what Wolsey was when we meet Wolsey at Wolf Hall. He is the most powerful person in the kingdom other than the king. And this book is a story of all the stuff he has to deal with between 1536 and 1540. I think probably the one complaint that some of you might have about this book is that it does go on. One thing after another. It doesn't seem to have a focused narrative arc. But it does. It does. The reason why you look at Wolf Hall and think there's a focused narrative arc there, and you look at Bring Up the Bodies and think there's a focused narrative there, is because you're looking outward from Cromwell's perspective at that focused narrative, which is the fall of Wolsey and the fall of Anne Boleyn. You can't do that. In a narrative that is looking through his eyes, you can't look out at the narrative here because it's the fall of Cromwell himself. Instead, this is what someone is doing in the 4 years before their fall. How aware are they of forces gathering against them? Where are their priorities? What seems important that they don't know because they don't know what's coming? That's what this novel is. We don't see Cromwell falling on hard times successively and successively and successively. Wolsey went into exile, basically, and was summoned back to London to the Tower, where to an end he knew he would face. He just died on the way. He didn't get to face it. And Anne knew that something of her end was coming because she knew that either she faked pregnancies or the children were born dead. She knew she was failing Henry. She had a little girl, little Elizabeth, but that's it. No boys. Does Cromwell know? That's one of the active narrative tensions in this book that I think will keep you reading, is how much does he know? How much is he wondering? The old families of England, the old entitled families of England, who all have Plantagenet blood in their veins, all think they have a better claim to the throne than Henry does, made a tacit deal with Cromwell to bring the Boleyns down. They did not like the Boleyns being set over them when the Boleyns are nobodies. Well, how much less do they like it with Cromwell? Those are the tensions in this book. And I believe that Hilary Mantel will capture you with her narrative, whether you've read the first two books or not. So I wanted to make a quick video just telling you where this story is. This is the story of the most powerful civilian in the land and the forces arrayed against him. Plenty of stuff happens. There are plenty of intrigues involving Henry's daughter Mary, involving Henry's niece Meg, involving the so-called Pilgrimage of Grace, involving those old and moneyed families and how they're dealing with Cromwell. It is captivating page by page, and I believe that will carry you through even if you haven't read the first two books. So I wanted to make this video to sort of bring you up to speed on the Cromwell story and make a pitch for you to join me in March. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.